A piercing scream echoed across the barren New Mexican landscape, as Elizabeth Chambers felt the earth give way beneath her feet, her body sinking with alarming speed into the murky, viscous pit of quicksand that had been concealed by a deceptive crust of sun-baked clay. It was the summer of 1876, and Elizabeth had arrived in Fort Stanton, New Mexico, just 3 days prior, sent by her father to live with her aunt following her mother's death from consumption. The journey west from Boston had been long and grueling, leaving the 20-year-old physically exhausted and emotionally drained. This morning, she had decided to explore the countryside surrounding her aunt's modest homestead, hoping the fresh air and change of scenery might lift her spirits. Now, as the quicksand greedily pulled her deeper, her decision to venture out alone seemed catastrophically foolish. "Help!" she cried out, her voice carrying across the empty expanse. "Somebody please help me." Elizabeth struggled to remain calm, recalling stories she'd heard about quicksand, how fighting against it only hastened one's demise. With deliberate effort, she forced herself to stop thrashing, trying to distribute her weight by leaning backward. The technique slowed her descent, but didn't halt it. The thick, soupy sand had already claimed her up to her waist, and panic clawed at her throat as she realized how truly alone she was. A mile away, Adam Reynolds was tracking a wounded coyote that had been harassing his cattle when he heard the distant cry. He reined his horse to a stop, tilting his head to listen. Years of living on the frontier had honed his senses, and he could distinguish a human cry of distress from the calls of wildlife. This was definitely human and female. Without hesitation, he turned his stallion toward the sound and urged the animal into a gallop. Adam had lived in the Fort Stanton area for 5 years, working as a rancher after serving as a cavalry scout. He knew the land intimately, including its dangers. Quicksand pits dotted the area near the creek beds, especially after the spring rains had saturated the ground. Elizabeth was fighting to control her mounting terror when she heard the thundering of hooves. Looking up, she saw a dust cloud approaching rapidly, and then a rider materialized. Hope surged through her as the horseman spotted her and changed direction, heading straight toward her predicament. "Hold still, madam," the man called out as he dismounted some distance from the edge of the quicksand. "Don't struggle, it'll only make you sink faster." I can't stop it," Elizabeth cried, feeling the sand creep up to her ribcage. Her hands fluttered uselessly at her sides, afraid to plunge them into the muck lest she lose what little stability she had managed to maintain. Adam assessed the situation quickly. The woman was sinking in one of the deepest quicksand pits he'd encountered, and there wasn't much time. He uncoiled the lariat rope from his saddle and fashioned a loop. "I'm going to throw this rope to you," he explained, his voice steady and reassuring. "When it comes near, grab it and wrap it around your wrists. Don't try to pull yourself out, I'll do the pulling." Elizabeth nodded, watching with desperate attention as he swung the rope and sent it arcing toward her. His first throw fell short. The second came closer, but still beyond her reach. By now, the quicksand had reached just below her shoulders, and she could feel its cold grip threatening to suffocate her. "Please," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Please." Adam's third throw was true. The loop landed directly over her head and shoulders. "Pull it down and get your arms through it," he instructed. With trembling hands, Elizabeth managed to grab the rope and slide it under her arms, creating a makeshift harness around her chest. The sand had now reached her collarbone, and she could feel its pressure against her lungs, making each breath a struggle. "I've got it," she called, her voice barely audible. Adam wrapped the other end of the rope around his saddle horn and began to lead his horse backward, applying steady pressure. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Elizabeth remained firmly in the grip of the quicksand. Then, with agonizing slowness, she felt herself begin to move upward. "It's working," she cried. The suction of the quicksand fought against her rescue, creating a vacuum that seemed determined to claim her. Adam continued the steady pull, his horse straining against the resistance. Elizabeth could feel the pressure on her chest and fought to keep her arms above the surface. "Keep your body as flat as you can," Adam called out. "Try to float on your back." Elizabeth attempted to follow his instructions, leaning backward as much as possible. Gradually, she felt the quicksand's grip loosening. With each passing second, more of her body emerged from the deadly pit. Finally, with one last strong pull from Adam's horse, she broke free from the muck and was dragged to solid ground. She lay there, gasping and covered in wet sand, too exhausted and relieved to move. Adam secured his horse and rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. Elizabeth shook her head, still unable to speak. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she became acutely aware of her appearance. Her dress was ruined, plastered with mud and sand, her hair a tangled mess. Yet the man beside her seemed concerned only with her well-being, not her disheveled state. I'm Elizabeth Chambers," she finally managed. "I cannot thank you enough for saving my life, Mr. Reynolds." "Adam Reynolds," he replied, removing his hat to reveal a shock of sun-bleached brown hair. His face was tanned from years under the southwestern sun, but his eyes were kind. "Most folks just call me Adam, Mr. Reynolds," Elizabeth said formally, attempting to regain some semblance of propriety despite her condition. "I am eternally in your debt." Adam helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. "No debt necessary, Miss Chambers. Anyone would have done the same. But no one else was here," she said softly, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "You were." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, or the first tendrils of a connection neither had anticipated. "You're not from around here," Adam observed, breaking the momentary spell. "Your accent Eastern," Elizabeth nodded. "Boston. I arrived just days ago to stay with my aunt, Margaret Whittaker. Her homestead is about 2 miles east of here." Margaret Whittaker. Adam's expression brightened with recognition. "I know Miss Margaret well. She makes the best apple preserves in the territory. I help her with repairs on her place from time to time." This coincidence seemed to ease some of the awkwardness between them. Adam helped Elizabeth brush off as much of the dried sand as possible, then offered her his canteen. "You should drink. The quicksand takes it out of you more than you realize." Elizabeth accepted gratefully, taking small sips of the cool water. As she drank, she studied her rescuer more carefully. Adam Reynolds was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical labor. His face was weathered but handsome, with laugh lines around his eyes suggesting he smiled often. He couldn't have been more than 30, she guessed. "I should get you back to your aunt's," Adam said, reclaiming his canteen. "She'll be worried if you're gone too long and you need to get cleaned up and rested after what you've been through." "Yes, of course," Elizabeth agreed, suddenly feeling the full weight of her exhaustion. Adam helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. The proximity was improper by Boston standards, but Elizabeth found herself too tired to protest, and if she were honest with herself, not entirely displeased by the arrangement. His presence at her back was solid and reassuring, his arms creating a protective circle around her as he held the reins. They rode in silence for a time, the rhythm of the horse's gait almost hypnotic. Elizabeth found herself leaning against Adam's chest, her eyes growing heavy. "Stay awake, Miss Chambers," he said gently. "We're almost there, but I need you to stay alert. Sometimes the shock can hit after the danger's passed." Elizabeth straightened, forcing herself to focus on their surroundings. "I apologize for my impropriety, Mr. Reynolds. No apologies needed." "You've had quite an ordeal," he replied. Then, after a pause, "If you don't mind my asking what brings a Boston lady to Fort Stanton, it's not exactly a destination for most Eastern folk." Elizabeth sighed, the pain of her recent loss still fresh. "My mother passed away 3 months ago. My father is not coping well. He thought it best I spend some time with Aunt Margaret while he sorts through his grief." "I'm sorry for your loss," Adam said, his voice genuinely sympathetic. "I lost my own mother when I was 16. It's not something that ever truly leaves you." "No, it isn't," Elizabeth agreed, touched by his understanding. They crested a small hill, and Margaret Whittaker's homestead came into view, a modest adobe house with a wooden porch, surrounded by a vegetable garden and a few outbuildings. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting her aunt was home. As they approached, the front door opened, and Margaret Whittaker emerged, a stout woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as she recognized her niece's bedraggled state. "Elizabeth, good heavens, child, what happened to you?" she exclaimed, hurrying down the porch steps. Adam dismounted first, then helped Elizabeth down. She swayed slightly as her feet touched the ground, and he kept a steadying hand at her elbow. "Your niece had a run-in with one of the quicksand pits near Bonito Creek, Miss Margaret," Adam explained. "She's had quite a scare, but she handled herself bravely." Margaret's face paled. "Quicksand? Oh, my dear girl, I should have warned you about those treacherous spots. Come inside immediately, you need to get warm and cleaned up." She turned to Adam with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for bringing her home, Adam. I can't bear to think what might have happened if you hadn't been nearby." "Just fortunate timing, madam," he replied modestly, replacing his hat. "I was tracking a coyote that's been after my calves when I heard her call for help." "You must stay for supper," Margaret insisted. "It's the least we can do to thank you." Adam hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth, who found herself hoping he would accept. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Margaret interrupted. "I've got a stew that's been simmering all day and plenty to share. Besides, I suspect Elizabeth would like to properly thank her rescuer once she's presentable again." Elizabeth felt a blush creep into her cheeks but nodded in agreement. "Please stay, Mr. Reynolds. I owe you far more than a meal, but it's a start." Something in her voice must have convinced him, for Adam nodded. "All right then, I'll see to my horse and join you shortly." As Margaret ushered Elizabeth inside to clean up, the young woman couldn't help glancing back at Adam. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. In the span of an hour, her perception of Fort Stanton had transformed completely from a place of exile to somewhere new possibilities might await. Elizabeth soaked in a copper tub filled with warm water, scrubbing away the last remnants of quicksand from her skin and hair. As she bathed, her thoughts kept returning to Adam Reynolds. There was something about him that intrigued her, a quiet strength combined with genuine kindness. In Boston, she had been courted by several well-bred young men, but none had affected her the way this frontier rancher had in their brief encounter. "You're being ridiculous," she chided herself softly. "The man saved your life, of course you feel drawn to him." Yet she couldn't dismiss the connection she'd felt when their eyes met. After dressing in a simple blue cotton dress, one of the few practical garments she'd brought from Boston, Elizabeth joined her aunt in the kitchen, helping to set the table for their guest. "Adam Reynolds is well respected in these parts," Margaret commented as she stirred the stew. "He came west after the war, served as a scout for the cavalry before settling on his ranch about 3 miles from here. Built it up from nothing, they say." "He mentioned helping you with repairs," Elizabeth said, trying to sound casual. Margaret smiled knowingly. "Yes, he's been a godsend since your uncle passed. Fixed my roof last winter, helps with the heavy work around the place, never accepts payment beyond a meal and maybe some preserves." She paused, giving Elizabeth an appraising look. "He's a good man, Elizabeth. Not the sort you might be accustomed to in Boston, perhaps, but solid through and through." Before Elizabeth could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Margaret nodded for her to answer it. Adam stood on the porch, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort to clean up. His hair was damp and combed, his shirt fresh. He had shaved, too, Elizabeth noticed, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden beneath a day's stubble. "Miss Chambers," he greeted her, a smile warming his features. "You're looking much recovered." "Thanks to you, Mr. Reynolds," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please come in, supper was a pleasant affair." Margaret did most of the talking at first, sharing local gossip and stories that gave Elizabeth insight into the community she now found herself part of. Gradually, Elizabeth began to participate more, asking questions about the territory and its customs. Adam answered patiently, his descriptions painting a vivid picture of frontier life. "It sounds harsh but beautiful," Elizabeth observed after Adam described the changing seasons in the New Mexico territory. "It is both," he agreed. "The land doesn't give its gifts easily here, but when it does." He trailed off, searching for words. "There's a sunrise that comes after the summer rains, the whole desert blooms, and the mountains turn this incredible shade of purple. Makes all the hardship worthwhile." The passion in his voice as he spoke of the land touched something in Elizabeth. She had come west out of necessity, not choice, viewing Fort Stanton as a temporary refuge rather than a potential home. Now, seeing it through Adam's eyes, she began to glimpse what might draw someone to this wild, untamed place. As the meal concluded, Margaret excused herself to fetch a pie she'd baked earlier, leaving Elizabeth and Adam alone at the table. "I never properly thanked you," Elizabeth said softly, "for saving my life today." "You did thank me," Adam pointed out with a gentle smile. "Words seem inadequate for what you did," she insisted. "I was so frightened, and then you appeared so calm and capable." She looked down at her hands, remembering the terror of being trapped. "I've never felt so helpless before." Adam reached across the table, his fingers lightly touching her wrist, a brief, reassuring contact that he withdrew almost immediately. "The frontier teaches you quickly that we all need help sometimes, Miss Chambers. No shame in that." "Elizabeth," she said impulsively. "Please call me Elizabeth." "Elizabeth," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. Margaret returned with the pie, breaking the moment between them. The conversation resumed its easy flow, but something had shifted. A door had opened, allowing the possibility of friendship, perhaps even something more. When Adam finally took his leave, the night sky was ablaze with stars, more than Elizabeth had ever seen in Boston's light-polluted skies. "May I call on you again?" Adam asked as he prepared to mount his horse. "Perhaps show you some of the safer parts of the territory. There's beauty here worth seeing." "I would like that very much," Elizabeth replied, surprising herself with how sincerely she meant it. As she watched him ride away, the moonlight silvering his silhouette against the dark landscape, Elizabeth felt a curious sensation, like the first page of a new book being turned, the story yet unwritten but full of promise. True to his word, Adam called at the Whitaker homestead 3 days later. He arrived mid-morning, leading not only his own horse but a gentle mare for Elizabeth to ride. "I borrowed her from the Wilkins family," he explained as Elizabeth admired the dappled gray horse. "Thought you might enjoy seeing more of the territory than you can on foot, but safely this time." Elizabeth had spent the intervening days helping her aunt with household chores and exploring the immediate vicinity of the homestead, carefully avoiding any areas that looked remotely marshy. The routine had helped settle her into life at Fort Stanton, but she found herself watching the road each day, hoping for Adam's return. "I'd love that," she said, stroking the mare's velvety nose. "Though I should warn you, my riding experience is limited to proper ladies' saddles in Boston parks." Adam smiled. "Daisy here is gentle as they come, and I thought we'd start slow, just ride to the overlook above Benito Creek. The view's worth the journey and the trail's well marked." With Margaret's blessing and a packed lunch, she insisted they take Elizabeth, and Adam set off. The day was perfect for riding, with a clear blue sky and a light breeze that kept the heat from becoming oppressive. Adam proved to be a patient teacher, showing Elizabeth how to properly mount and control her horse on the western terrain, which was considerably different from the manicured paths of Boston's public gardens. By the time they reached the overlook he'd mentioned, Elizabeth was feeling much more confident in the saddle. The view, as Adam had promised, was spectacular. The creek wound like a silver ribbon through the valley below, bordered by cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered in the breeze. In the distance, mountains rose in purple majesty against the horizon. "It's breathtaking," Elizabeth said softly as they dismounted to rest the horses. "Worth coming west for?" Adam asked, unpacking the lunch Margaret had provided. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "I'm beginning to think so," she admitted. "When my father sent me here, I viewed it as a sort of exile. Now," she gestured at the panorama before them, "now I'm not so sure." They settled on a blanket Adam had brought, sharing the food and conversation that flowed surprisingly easily between them. Elizabeth found herself telling him about her life in Boston, her education at a prestigious ladies' seminary, her mother's long illness, her father's withdrawal into grief and work. "He's a good man," she hastened to add, not wanting Adam to think poorly of her father. "Just lost without my mother. They were devoted to each other." "That kind of love leaves a mark when it's gone," Adam observed quietly. My parents were the same way. After my mother died, my father was never quite the same. It's partly why I came west after the war, too many ghosts back in Pennsylvania. Do you ever regret leaving? Elizabeth asked, curious about the path that had brought him to Fort Stanton. Adam gazed out over the landscape, taking his time before answering. No, he said finally. I found something here I didn't have back east, a purpose, I suppose. Building something that's entirely mine, living by my own labor. He glanced at her, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. Does that sound foolish to a Boston lady? Not at all, Elizabeth replied earnestly. It sounds liberating. Their conversation turned to Adam's ranch, the cattle he raised, the improvements he was making to the land, his hopes for expanding once he could afford more acreage. Elizabeth listened with genuine interest, finding his passion for his work captivating. I'd like to see it someday, she said when he finished describing the small orchard he'd started the previous year. Your ranch, I mean. Something flickered in Adam's eyes, pleasure mingled with uncertainty. It's not much compared to what you're used to. I'd still like to see it, she insisted. The day passed with remarkable swiftness. They rode further along the ridge, with Adam pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area's history. He knew an impressive amount about the native Mescalero Apache tribes who had lived in the region long before white settlers arrived. Speaking of them with respect, rather than the fear or disdain Elizabeth had often heard expressed back east. By late afternoon, they had circled back toward Margaret's homestead. As they approached, Elizabeth felt a curious reluctance for the day to end. Their time together had been comfortable, natural in a way she hadn't experienced with any of her Boston acquaintances. Thank you for today, she said as they dismounted in front of her aunt's house. I feel I've learned more about New Mexico in one afternoon than I could have from any book. The pleasure was mine, Adam replied, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than strictly proper. Perhaps we could do this again. There's a small settlement celebration happening in Fort Stanton next Saturday. Music, dancing, food. It's nothing fancy like Boston society events, I'm sure, but I'd love to attend, Elizabeth interrupted, her heart quickening at the prospect. Truly. Adam's smile brightened his entire face. Then I'll call for you around midday Saturday if that suits. Perfectly, she agreed. As he rode away, leading Daisy beside his stallion, Elizabeth found herself standing on the porch long after he'd disappeared from view, replaying moments from their day together in her mind. Margaret's knowing smile when she finally went inside only confirmed what Elizabeth was beginning to suspect: something significant had changed in her life. Something that had begun the moment Adam Reynolds had pulled her from the Quicksand's deadly grip. The days leading up to Saturday passed with agonizing slowness for Elizabeth. She helped Margaret with household chores, wrote letters to her father in Boston describing her new life, carefully omitting the Quicksand incident, which would only worry him, and explored the immediate surroundings of the homestead. Yet her thoughts constantly drifted to Adam and their upcoming outing. Margaret watched her niece's anticipation with amusement. You've taken quite a shine to our Mr. Reynolds, she observed one evening as they sat on the porch, shelling peas. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. He's been kind, showing me the territory. Margaret hummed, unconvinced by Elizabeth's casual tone. He's never offered to escort anyone to the settlement celebration before, not in all the years I've known him. This information gave Elizabeth a small thrill that she tried to hide from her aunt. Perhaps he's just being neighborly, helping the Eastern newcomer adjust, Margaret chuckled. If that's what you need to tell yourself, dear. She patted Elizabeth's hand affectionately. Adam Reynolds is worth 10 of those Boston dandies your father probably hoped you'd marry. I've seen how he looks at you like you're something rare and precious. Elizabeth couldn't sleep that night, her aunt's words echoing in her mind. Did Adam truly see her that way? And more troublingly, what would her father think of her developing feelings for a frontier rancher? Saturday dawned clear and bright. Elizabeth spent extra time preparing for the day, choosing her most practical yet becoming dress, a cornflower blue cotton with white trim that complemented her fair complexion and auburn hair. She twisted her hair into a neat chignon, allowing a few curls to frame her face in a style that was fashionable yet appropriate for the frontier setting. Adam arrived precisely at midday, driving a polished buckboard wagon rather than riding horseback. Elizabeth's heart skipped when she saw him. He had clearly made an effort for the occasion, wearing a clean white shirt, dark vest, and what appeared to be new denim trousers. His usually unruly hair was neatly combed and his boots were polished to a shine. "Miss Chambers," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," she replied, suddenly shy despite the easy companionship they had established on their previous outing. "You're looking quite handsome yourself." A pleased smile crossed his face at her compliment. He helped her into the wagon with gentle hands, the brief contact sending a flutter through her stomach. The ride to Fort Stanton proper took about 30 minutes. Adam pointed out various landmarks along the way, telling her stories about the region's history and the establishment of the fort, which had originally been built to protect settlers from Apache raids, but now served primarily as a trading hub for the surrounding ranches and homesteads. As they approached, Elizabeth could see that the settlement was already bustling with activity. Colorful bunting decorated the main buildings, and tables had been set up in the central square. A small group of musicians was tuning instruments on a makeshift stage, and the tantalizing aroma of barbecue filled the air. "What's the occasion for the celebration?" Elizabeth asked as Adam helped her down from the wagon. "The founding of the settlement," he explained. "Every year around this time, folks gather to celebrate surviving another year out here. It might seem simple compared to Eastern society events, but it's wonderful," Elizabeth interrupted sincerely, taking in the scene with genuine delight. The unpretentious joy of the gathering was refreshing after the often stifling formality of Boston's social calendar. Adam offered his arm, which she took without hesitation. "Let me introduce you to some people. Most everyone's curious about Margaret's niece from Boston." The afternoon passed in a whirl of new faces and names, as Adam introduced Elizabeth to what seemed like the entire population of Fort Stanton and its surrounding homesteads. She met the local doctor, the general store proprietor, the blacksmith and his family, and dozens of ranchers and farmers who had come to town for the celebration. Everyone welcomed her warmly, though many seemed surprised to see Adam Reynolds accompanying anyone to a social gathering. "You've caused quite a stir," Elizabeth teased as they took a break to enjoy plates of barbecued beef and cornbread. "I gather you don't usually attend these functions." Adam looked slightly embarrassed. "I come for the trading and business, but I usually don't stay for the socializing," he admitted. "Never had much reason to before." The simple statement, delivered without artifice, touched Elizabeth deeply. In Boston, men had courted her with flowery compliments and grand gestures. Adam's straightforward honesty felt infinitely more meaningful. As evening approached, the music grew livelier. Lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm, golden glow over the proceedings. Couples began to gather for dancing, not the formal, choreographed dances of Boston ballrooms, but energetic, joyful movements that matched the fiddle and guitar music. "Would you care to dance?" Adam asked, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I should warn you, I'm not much practiced at it." "I'd be delighted," Elizabeth replied, taking his offered hand. "And I suspect frontier dancing is quite different from what I learned in Boston, so we can muddle through together." His hand was warm and calloused against hers as he led her to the area cleared for dancing. After an initial awkwardness as they found their rhythm, Elizabeth discovered that Adam was a better dancer than he had claimed. He moved with natural grace, his arms strong and secure around her waist as they spun to the lively music. As the evening progressed, the tune slowed. During one particularly sweet melody, Adam held her closer than propriety might strictly allow, but Elizabeth found she didn't mind. In the golden lantern light, with stars appearing in the darkening sky above them, she felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced in Boston. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," she said softly as they swayed to the music. "I can't remember when I've enjoyed myself more." Adam's eyes, fixed on hers, held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Elizabeth," he began, then hesitated. I know you've only been here a short time, and you probably plan to return to Boston eventually, but whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the square. A rider had arrived, clearly in haste, his horse lathered with sweat. People gathered around him as he delivered some urgent news. Adam frowned. "Stay here," he told Elizabeth, moving toward the growing crowd. She waited anxiously, watching as Adam spoke with the messenger and several other men, their expressions growing increasingly serious. When he returned to her side a few minutes later, his face was grim. "What is it?" she asked, concerned by the change in his demeanor. "Cattle rustlers hit the Peterson place about 10 miles north of here," he explained. "Took most of his herd and burned his barn. The sheriff's organizing a posse to track them before they can get far. I need to join them." Elizabeth's heart sank, but she understood. This was part of frontier life, the community banding together in times of trouble. "Of course you must go," she said, though she couldn't quite keep the disappointment from her voice. Adam took her hand, his expression softening. "I'll have one of the Wilkins boys drive you back to your aunt's. I'm sorry our evening has to end this way." "Don't apologize," Elizabeth insisted. "Go help your neighbors, that's more important." He hesitated, then leaned forward and with surprising gentleness pressed a brief kiss to her cheek. "I'll come see you when I return," he promised, his voice low and earnest. Before she could respond, he was gone, joining the group of men gathering at the far end of the square. Elizabeth watched as they collected weapons and mounted their horses, riding out of town with determined expressions. The festive atmosphere of the celebration had evaporated, replaced by concern and quiet conversations. True to Adam's word, young Thomas Wilkins, a boy of about 16, drove Elizabeth back to Margaret's homestead in his family's wagon. She sat silently beside him, her thoughts with Adam and the danger he might be facing. Cattle rustlers were known to be desperate, violent men, not likely to surrender without a fight. Margaret was waiting up when Elizabeth arrived, having already heard about the rustlers from a passing neighbor. "Adam's gone with the posse?" she asked as Elizabeth entered the house. Elizabeth nodded, unable to hide her worry. "He said he'd come when he returns." Margaret patted her hand sympathetically. "That's our life out here, child. The men ride out to face whatever trouble comes, and the women wait and pray for their safe return." "He's not, we're not." Elizabeth stumbled over her words, unsure how to define what existed between her and Adam. "Not yet, perhaps," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "But you're heading that way unless I miss my guess, and I seldom do." That night, Elizabeth lay awake long after her aunt had retired, thinking about Adam facing danger in the darkness. She realized with startling clarity that Margaret was right in the short time she had known him. Adam Reynolds had become immensely important to her. The prospect of his not returning safely was unbearable. "Please come back," she whispered into the darkness, a prayer to whoever might be listening. 3 days passed with no word from the posse. Elizabeth tried to keep busy helping Margaret with household chores and tending the garden, but her thoughts constantly strayed to Adam. Each time a rider appeared on the road, her heart would leap, only to sink again when it proved to be someone else. On the morning of the 4th day, Margaret sent Elizabeth to Fort Stanton to purchase supplies they needed. "The waiting will drive you mad if you don't get out of the house," her aunt insisted. "Besides, you might hear news in town." The general store was buzzing with conversation when Elizabeth arrived. Snippets reached her as she gathered the items on Margaret's list. The posse had tracked the rustlers into the mountains. There had been a confrontation. Shots had been fired. "Excuse me," she finally said to Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, who was helping her. "Has there been any definite news about the posse? Have they returned?" Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with understanding. "You're asking about Adam Reynolds, aren't you, dear? I saw you two at the celebration." Elizabeth blushed but didn't deny it. "Is he? Do you know if everyone is safe?" "The posse returned late last night," Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "They recovered most of the stolen cattle. 2 of the rustlers were killed in the fight, and one of our men was wounded. Jim Harper took a bullet in the shoulder, but Doc Martin says he'll recover." "And Adam?" Elizabeth pressed, hardly daring to breathe. "He's fine, dear, tired and dirty from the trail, I expect, but unharmed," Mrs. Patterson patted her hand kindly. "He's a good man, Adam Reynolds, been alone too long, if you ask me." Relief washed over Elizabeth, so intense she had to steady herself against the counter. "Thank you," she managed. She completed her purchases and was preparing to leave when the store's door opened, and Adam himself walked in. He looked exhausted, his clothes dusty from the trail, dark stubble shadowing his jaw, fatigue evident in the set of his shoulders. But when he saw Elizabeth, his entire demeanor transformed, weariness giving way to joy. "Elizabeth," he said, crossing to her in a few long strides, "I was just on my way to see you." "I heard the posse returned," she replied, drinking in the sight of him, whole and unharmed. "I'm so glad you're safe." There was an awkward moment as they stood facing each other, clearly wanting to say more but constrained by the public setting and Mrs. Patterson's interested gaze. "May I walk you back to your wagon?" Adam finally asked. Outside, away from curious eyes, Adam took Elizabeth's hands in his. "I thought about you every night on the trail," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "When the shooting started, all I could think was that I had to make it back to you." Elizabeth's heart raced at his words. "I was so worried," she confessed. "I kept imagining the worst." Adam's gaze searched her face, finding something there that gave him courage. "Elizabeth, I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. When I pulled you from that quicksand, I didn't realize I was saving my own future happiness." His declaration, simple and heartfelt, moved Elizabeth deeply. In Boston, courtship was a careful dance of social conventions and proper intervals. Here on the frontier, life was too uncertain, too precious to waste on such formalities. "I feel the same," she said softly. "These past days, not knowing if you were safe, made me realize how important you've become to me." Adam's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'd like to court you properly if you'll allow it. I know I'm not the sort of man your father probably envisioned for you. My father wants my happiness," Elizabeth interrupted. "And I've found more joy in these few weeks here than in years in Boston." Adam raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I have to see to some business in town, but I'll call on you tomorrow with your aunt's permission." "She'll be delighted," Elizabeth assured him, knowing Margaret would indeed approve wholeheartedly. They parted reluctantly, but with the promise of tomorrow brightening the separation. As Elizabeth drove the wagon back to her aunt's homestead, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The wilderness that had initially seemed so alien and threatening now felt like the setting for a new chapter in her life, one filled with possibilities she had never imagined in Boston. True to his word, Adam called at Margaret's homestead the following day. This began a courtship that progressed with the natural rhythm of frontier life, direct and unencumbered by the elaborate social rituals Elizabeth had known in the East. Adam visited whenever his ranch duties allowed, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the prairie, a book of Western poetry he'd found in town, a handkerchief he'd asked the seamstress to embroider with her initials. 2 weeks after the cattle rustling incident, Adam invited Elizabeth to visit his ranch. Margaret, playing the role of chaperone, accompanied them on the short journey to Adam's property, which lay about 3 miles west of her homestead. Elizabeth wasn't sure what she had expected, but the reality of Adam's ranch impressed her deeply. The main house was modest but solidly built of timber and stone, with a wide porch that caught the afternoon breeze. Nearby stood a well-constructed barn, corrals for the cattle and horses, and several smaller outbuildings. A creek ran through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. "It's not much compared to Eastern homes," Adam said as he showed them around, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "It's wonderful," Elizabeth replied with genuine admiration. "You've built all this yourself, with some help from neighbors for the larger projects," he acknowledged. "But yes, most of it is my own work." The pride in his voice was justified. Elizabeth could see the care and craftsmanship that had gone into every aspect of the ranch. This was no temporary shelter, but a permanent home built to last generations. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, a large main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, and 2 bedrooms at the back. Adam had furnished it sparsely but with quality pieces, some clearly handmade. What struck Elizabeth most was how the home seemed to reflect Adam himself straightforward, solid without pretense but with an underlying warmth and character. "It needs a woman's touch," Margaret observed bluntly as they sat on the porch enjoying coffee Adam had prepared. "But the bones are good." Elizabeth blushed at her aunt's implication, but Adam merely smiled. "I've always thought so," he agreed, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's with unmistakable meaning. Over the weeks that followed, Elizabeth and Adam's relationship deepened. They spent long hours together, riding across the territory, picnicking by the creek that ran through his property, or simply sitting on Margaret's porch talking as the sun set. Elizabeth found herself opening up to him about her hopes and fears in a way she never had with anyone in Boston. In turn, Adam shared stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his experiences during the war, his journey west, and the challenges of establishing his ranch. One evening in late August, as they walked along the creek near Margaret's homestead, Adam stopped beneath a large cottonwood tree. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "Elizabeth," he said, taking both her hands in his, "these past months have been the happiest of my life." She smiled up at him, her heart full. "Mine too. When I first came to New Mexico, I thought I was just looking for land to build a ranch," Adam continued, his voice growing more serious. "Now I realize I was looking for a home, and home isn't just a place, it's the person you share it with." Elizabeth felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized where his words were leading. Adam reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right person." He knelt before her, still holding her hands. "Elizabeth Chambers, I love you more than I thought possible. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to anticipate this moment, the reality of it, Adam kneeling before her, his heart in his eyes, overwhelmed Elizabeth. Her response came without hesitation, rising from the deepest truth in her heart. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Adam, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had always been meant for her hand. Adam rose and drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. When they returned to the homestead, hand in hand with Elizabeth's ring catching the last rays of sunset, Margaret took one look at them and burst into delighted tears. She embraced them both, declaring she'd known from the moment Adam had brought Elizabeth home from the Quicksand that they were destined for each other. "Have you thought about when?" Margaret asked as they sat on the porch, discussing the engagement. Elizabeth and Adam exchanged glances. "I was thinking perhaps October," Adam suggested. "Before winter sets in, unless that's too soon." "October is perfect," Elizabeth agreed. Her only reservation was her father's absence. "But I should write to my father immediately. I wish he could be here." "Do you think he would come?" Adam asked, understanding her concern. Elizabeth considered the question carefully. Her father had been withdrawn since her mother's death, focused entirely on his business affairs. "I don't know," she admitted. "The journey is long, and he's not been one for travel since Mother died. But I want his blessing, at least." "Then write to him tonight," Adam encouraged. "Tell him everything. If he can come, we'll delay the wedding if necessary." Elizabeth composed the letter that very evening, pouring her heart into explaining her unexpected happiness and her hope that her father would share in it. She described Adam in detail, his character, his achievements, his kindness, and enclosed a separate note from Adam himself, man to man. The letter dispatched, there was nothing to do but wait and proceed with wedding preparations. The community of Fort Stanton embraced the news with enthusiasm. Elizabeth was touched by how many of the local women offered assistance. Mrs. Patterson from the general store organized a quilting bee to create a wedding quilt. The blacksmith's wife provided recipes and cooking lessons to prepare Elizabeth for managing her own household. Young girls from neighboring homesteads collected wildflowers to press for wedding decorations. 3 weeks after sending her letter, a response arrived from Boston. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she broke the seal, Adam standing supportively at her side. Her father's letter was brief but heartfelt. He expressed surprise at her news but acknowledged the sincerity of her feelings. He gave his blessing to the marriage, enclosing a substantial bank draft as a wedding gift, but regretted that his health and business affairs prevented him from making the journey west. "He's not coming," Elizabeth said softly, disappointment evident in her voice despite her attempt to hide it. Adam's arm went around her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I know how much it would have meant to have him here." She leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his presence. "At least he's given his blessing, and he seems to approve of you from what I told him." "I'll write to him again," Adam promised. "Let him know I understand the man I'm getting for a father-in-law, even if we haven't met in person yet." His consideration touched Elizabeth deeply. It was one of the countless ways Adam showed his love, not through grand gestures, but through consistent thoughtfulness and respect for her feelings. As October approached, wedding preparations intensified. The ceremony would be held at the small church in Fort Stanton, with a celebration afterward at Adam's ranch, their future home together. Elizabeth divided her time between helping Margaret with harvest preparations at the homestead and adding feminine touches to Adam's house. She sewed curtains for the windows, arranged furniture, and planted flower bulbs that would bloom the following spring. One crisp morning, a week before the wedding, Elizabeth was at Adam's ranch, organizing the kitchen supplies they'd purchased in town, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Expecting it might be Margaret, who had promised to bring over some preserved fruits for the pantry, she went to the door. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. A well-dressed gentleman in his 50s was descending from a hired wagon, looking tired from travel but unmistakably familiar. "Father," Elizabeth gasped, hardly believing her eyes. Robert Chambers turned at the sound of her voice, his weathered face breaking into a smile that reminded her powerfully of her mother. "Elizabeth, my dear girl." She flew down the porch steps and into his arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You came." "But your letter said—" "I know what my letter said," he interrupted, holding her at arm's length to look at her. "But after I sent it, I realized I couldn't miss my only daughter's wedding. Some things are more important than business affairs." Elizabeth led her father into the house, her mind whirling with questions and joy. "How did you find me here? I wasn't expected at the ranch today. Your aunt directed me," he explained, "said I might find you here making a home of the place." He looked around the main room with appraising eyes. "It's more substantial than I expected, I must admit." "Adam built most of it himself," Elizabeth said proudly. "He should be back from the north pasture soon. He's bringing in the last of the cattle before winter." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Elizabeth went to the door to see Adam dismounting, looking surprised at the unfamiliar wagon in his yard. "Adam," she called, her voice brimming with excitement. "Come meet my father." The meeting between the two men most important to Elizabeth was initially awkward but quickly warmed. Robert Chambers was a shrewd judge of character, and in Adam's straightforward manner and obvious devotion to Elizabeth, he recognized qualities worth respecting. For his part, Adam treated his future father-in-law with genuine interest and respect, eager to know the man who had raised the woman he loved. By evening, as they sat around Adam's table sharing a meal Elizabeth had prepared, Robert was regaling them with stories of Elizabeth's childhood in Boston. "She was always adventurous," he recalled fondly. "Her mother worried constantly, but I always said Elizabeth would find her way in the world." He raised his coffee cup in a toast. "I just didn't expect her way would lead quite so far west." "Are you disappointed, father?" Elizabeth asked softly. Robert shook his head. "Seeing you now so vibrant, so clearly in your element, how could I be? Your mother would have been happy for you too, knowing you've found love." His gaze shifted to Adam. "She always said the right man for our daughter would be one who saw her strength, not just her beauty." "Her strength was the first thing I noticed," Adam replied, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's across the table. "The day we met, most people would have panicked completely in her situation, but even trapped in quicksand, she had the presence of mind to follow instructions and help in her own rescue. Quicksand, Robert's eyebrows shot up. Elizabeth, you never mentioned this in your letters. Elizabeth shot Adam a playful glare. I didn't want to worry you, she explained to her father. It was shortly after I arrived. Robert insisted on hearing the full story which Adam and Elizabeth related together, each filling in details from their perspective. By the end, Robert was shaking his head in amazement. It seems I owe you a debt of gratitude beyond measure, he said to Adam. You saved my daughter's life. She's saved mine in return, Adam replied simply, just in a different way. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations and family bonding. Robert stayed at Margaret's homestead, but spent much of each day with Elizabeth and Adam, getting to know his future son-in-law and the community his daughter would be part of. He found himself increasingly impressed by the tight-knit nature of frontier society, how neighbors supported each other through hardships, and celebrated together in times of joy. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, a perfect October morning with the aspens in the distant mountains turned to gold. The small church in Fort Stanton was filled to capacity with well-wishers from throughout the territory. Elizabeth wore a gown of ivory silk that Margaret and several local women had helped her sew, adorned with lace her father had brought from Boston. Her mother's pearl earrings completed her ensemble, a touch of the East to complement her new Western life. Adam, standing at the altar in a new black suit, watched with wonder as Elizabeth walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The love in his eyes as he took her hand before the preacher brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers present. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love and support each other through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Adam's kiss was tender yet passionate, a fitting beginning to their married life. The celebration that followed at their ranch was joyous and lasted well into the evening. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by neighbors. Lanterns hung from trees, casting a golden glow over the festivities as musicians played and couples danced beneath the stars. As the night deepened and guests began to depart, Elizabeth found herself standing on the porch of what was now truly her home, her father beside her. "Are you happy with your choice, Elizabeth?" he asked quietly. "This life will not be easy compared to what you might have had in Boston." Elizabeth looked out at the gathering where Adam was saying goodbye to the last departing guests. "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied. "This is where I belong, Father, with Adam in this place." Robert nodded, a hint of wistfulness in his smile. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." He hesitated, then added, "I'm considering selling the Boston house." "Father," Elizabeth turned to him in surprise. "It's too large for just me," he explained, "and there's a promising business opportunity in Denver. It would mean I could visit more often." Joy surged through Elizabeth at the prospect. "You would move west, not as far west as you," he qualified with a chuckle, "but closer, yes. If you think there might be room for your old father in your new life from time to time." "Always," she assured him, embracing him tightly. "Always." Adam joined them on the porch, slipping an arm around Elizabeth's waist. "The last guests have gone," he told them, "though Mrs. Patterson insists we won't need to cook for a week with all the food she's left." Robert clapped his son-in-law on the shoulder. "I should return to Margaret's and let you two begin your married life properly," he said. "I'll come by tomorrow before I start my journey back east." After her father had departed in the wagon Adam had arranged for him, Elizabeth and Adam stood together on the porch of their home, arms around each other as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. "Happy, Mrs. Reynolds?" Adam asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely," Elizabeth sighed, leaning into his embrace. "Though it still feels a bit like a dream that I came west expecting exile and found home instead." Adam turned her in his arms to face him, his expression serious. "The day I pulled you from that quicksand, I made a promise to myself," he confessed. "That if you gave me the chance, I'd never let you sink again, not in quicksand, not in sorrow, not in anything life might throw at us." Elizabeth raised a hand to his cheek, deeply moved by his words. "And I promise the same to you. Whatever challenges come, we'll face them together." His kiss sealed their private vows, a promise as binding as those they had exchanged in the church. As Adam swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold into their home, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that their life together would be rich with joy, love, and adventure, a far greater treasure than anything she might have found had she remained in Boston. In the years that followed, Elizabeth and Adam built a life together that exceeded both their dreams. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Adam's practical knowledge, combined with Elizabeth's Eastern education and keen mind, proved a formidable partnership. They expanded the cattle operation, added sheep, and enlarged the orchard Elizabeth had come to love tending. 2 years after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, a son they named Robert Thomas Reynolds, after both her father and Adam's. The boy had his father's sturdy build and his mother's quick mind. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Margaret Rose, with auburn curls like Elizabeth's and Adam's thoughtful brown eyes. Robert Chambers made good on his promise to move to Denver, where he established a successful import business. He visited Fort Stanton frequently, delighting in watching his grandchildren grow and developing a deep friendship with his son-in-law. When Margaret Whittaker passed away peacefully 5 years after Elizabeth and Adam's wedding, she left her homestead to her niece. Adam incorporated the additional land into their ranch, keeping the original house as a guest cottage where Robert stayed during his visits. Elizabeth never returned to Boston. She found in New Mexico everything she needed: family, purpose, community, and a love that deepened with each passing year. The challenges of frontier life, droughts, harsh winters, occasional tensions with neighboring tribes, only strengthened the bond between her and Adam, proving the wisdom of their wedding day promises to support each other through whatever came. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Adam surprised Elizabeth with a special gift: a small, ornately carved wooden box. Inside, preserved under glass, was a coil of rope. "Is this?" she asked, recognizing its significance immediately. Adam nodded. "The lariat that pulled you from the quicksand. I've kept it all these years." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she looked from the rope to her husband's face. "Our beginning. The best day of my life," Adam agreed, drawing her into his arms, "though every day since has come close." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching their children playing in the yard, the setting sun painting the land in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her west. What had seemed at first a misfortune, being sent away from her home in a time of grief, had led her to a richer, fuller life than she could ever have imagined in Boston. "What are you thinking about?" Adam asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Elizabeth smiled, taking his hand in hers. "About quicksand," she replied, "and how sometimes what looks like sinking can actually be the beginning of rising." Adam squeezed her hand, understanding as he always did. Together they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future might bring, they would face it as they had faced the past decades, side by side, never letting each other sink.